Good evening, everyone. It is so wonderful to see all of you. I want to officially say welcome to the 2024 College of Education Dean's Lecture. My name is Kimberly Griffin. I am the pleased and proud Dean of the College of Education. Thank you. And I just could not be more delighted to see all of you here. I know I got to see a lot of you out in the lobby. I've seen some of you around the Benjamin Building, but if I have not seen you yet, Happy New Year. We're at the very start of the academic year, and the start of the academic year for me always has a really special energy, right? Like you can feel it moving through the building, and we're all thinking about the future. We're all, hopeful about what's going to happen. And certainly, I like to ride on the energy. I like to ride on the vibes, like the young people like to say. But I'm also thinking, as a dean, about our goals. What are we planning to do? And it's a really important moment to reflect on what are we trying to achieve, not only individually, but together as a community. So we are unveiling our new strategic plan. Deans are very excited about strategic plans on Friday. And we did a lot of work before we even started on, goals and priorities. We started with our mission and with our vision. And in doing that work, we certainly talked about, what are the things that we are, what are the things that we do. But one of the things we kept coming back to is what kind of community did we want to be? How did we want to show up together? And we wanted to make sure that that was really clearly reflected in our values. So we came up with 3. That our values are innovation for transformation, equity and justice, and collaboration with care. Our work together and my own leadership as your dean is driven by the fundamental belief that our ability to transform education for good, that's what we're all here to do, right, is inextricably tied to our ability to connect and to collaborate with each other. So events like our Dean's Lecture Series are a perfect reflection of our values and our approach to doing work that transforms education and transforms lives. Yeah. For those new to our event, it's our annual opportunity to come together as a community and to really have conversations about important ideas. And we are so lucky that those ideas often come straight from the mouths of the most important and I think most engaging thought leaders in our field. So tonight's event is no different. We are honored to have Dr. Na'ilah Nasir with us here today. Dr. Nasir is the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation, which has been the leading funder of education research since 1971, and it is the only national foundation focused exclusively on supporting education research. Dr. Nasir is a proud graduate of UC Berkeley and UCLA and served on Stanford University's faculty before returning to UC Berkeley as a professor and later as vice chancellor of equity and inclusion. As a well-known and highly regarded scholar in the areas of race, culture, learning, and identity, she has been inducted to the National Academy of Education and as a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and she also served as AERA's president from 2021 to 2022. I have to say that Dr. Nasir and her work and her impact take my breath away. For me, impact has always meant that my work, our work, doesn't stay on shelves. It doesn't stay in academic journals. It moves from the pages of books, it leaps off of our computer screens and flows through policies and programs into our schools and into our communities. This is all nice to say. It's nice to aspire to. But the arc of Dr. Nasir's career is a masterclass in how we activate this process, how we support and center the importance of critical, rigorous research in tackling the grandest challenges of our time. Simply said, as a scholar, as an administrator, and as a fellow California girl, I am such a fan. And I am just as excited as all of you to hear thoughts on the critical role of philanthropy in initiating, accelerating, and sustaining educational transformation. So after her talk, she and I will have a little chat here on the stage, and we also will invite you all to ask some questions. But I don't want to take up any more time on this stage. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you here, Na'ilah, and we are so happy to have you as our featured speaker, Dr. Na'ilah Nasir.
Great. Wow, that was such a beautiful introduction. Thank you all for being here. Excited to be with you this evening. I forgot, when they invited me, they told me Sean Harper was the last speaker here, and I didn't think about it until a few minutes ago, and I was like, dang, now I'm following Sean Harper. Whew. I know we're running opposite the presidential debate, so if you need to like sneak your phone, I'm not, no judgment here. So what I'm going to share today is a set of things I've been pondering. When I became president of AERA, I was super thrilled, except the part where you have to give a big talk in a big room with the whole field, because I was like, I'm not really a scholar anymore. Well, okay, once a scholar, always a scholar, but I hadn't done any new work to present for a presidential address. And so it made me really have to think about what I had to say to the field from where I sit now, from the range of experiences I've had since being a scholar wasn't my primary identity anymore. And this talk kind of builds on that a bit. So I'm going to be talking about a vision for education. What is the education system that we need for a true multicultural democracy that centers learning and thriving for young people and communities? Been talking about that for a while. But I'm also going to talk about the kind of research the world needs from us as researchers to support that vision. And then the kind of brand new part that I've done with my board and I've done with my friends, but I haven't done publicly, is what is the kind of philanthropy that can help foster such research to be more prevalent and more powerful. So it's kind of a three-part builds on itself. So my goal is to kind of build those links explicitly about the set of connections that has mostly existed in my head, and to do so in a way that is reflective about the practice of philanthropy and about how we as a sector could and should be engaging and doing our work. I can't find my cursor. In support of that bigger vision. Okay. So the title of my talk is The Power of Belonging Philanthropy and Transformative Research in Education. I'm going to explain all those terms as we go. In 2017, I became president of the Spencer Foundation. It was a surprise to me and probably many others. Not because I wasn't qualified, because what qualifies you to be in philanthropy anyway, but because up to that point, the foundation, because of what the foundation had largely focused on up to that point, right? Then the fact that I'd spent my whole career thinking about race and equity and culture in education, a kind of work that the foundation had certainly funded, my work included, but hadn't centered in its view of rigorous scholarship. Prior to that, I was a vice chancellor of equity and inclusion at Berkeley, where I had also been a faculty member in education and chair of African American Studies. And so taking this role at Spencer stretched me, changed me, and it's changed the foundation too. That's part of what we're going to talk about. And so in part, this talk is about that journey, what equity work looks like from the perch of a foundation, and kind of some lessons learned. So I'm hoping to share with you some things about what we're up to at Spencer, what the journey to get there has been, and how we're thinking about the future of education research and the role of philanthropy in stewarding that future. My comments and thoughts are rooted, I hope you will find, in hope and possibility and a focus on what could be. And my goal is to wonder aloud what it might look like if we decided to really embrace our collective power to define, to reimagine, to craft new horizons of what's possible. So this is kind of my outline. I'm going to take up this central question: what's the role of education research and philanthropy in re-envisioning education? And I'm going to start with some framing. What are the challenges we're facing now, and what are the openings? I'm going to introduce some key concepts and ideas that I'll carry through the talk. In particular, I'm going to theorize the concepts of othering and belonging, building on John Powell's work, that will serve as a grounding set of ideas, and I think offers a productive way for us to think about diversity and equity in ways that get us to the future we want. Then I'm going to turn my lens to research. What role can research play in creating education systems for belonging and equity? How can it do that work? And what kinds of research do we need? And perhaps almost as important, what do we need to stop doing as researchers? And that'll bring me to my discussion of belonging philanthropy. That is the importance of both what we fund and how we fund for supporting the kinds of education systems that our children deserve. And then I'll offer a few reflections and concluding thoughts. Underlying my talk is a deep and abiding commitment to public education. And like full stop. and a belief that a strong and rigorous public school system is the cornerstone of a multicultural democracy. Creating such a system should be our focus as a field, and it is imperative that we do so. And we can. Okay, one more note before I jump in. When I talk about philanthropy, it's important to hold that that's an umbrella for many different kinds of things. There's a joke that folks in the philanthropic sector use, which is, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. Spencer takes up a very specific place in the philanthropic arena, and it has what I have come to think of as a beautifully constrained mission. We focus solely on funding research, education research. So my comments about Belonging Philanthropy are most relevant kind of in this space where I'm working. So if you're in the philanthropic sector, super curious at the end about whether you feel like what I've said applies to your work and the ways in which it kind of does and doesn't. Okay, go to lay the foundation. And there's kind of a lot of laying the foundations. I got a little carried away, so it's going to go for a minute on some core ideas. But I'm talking about challenges, openings, grounding ideas. So here we are. No doubt we are in really complex times on many levels. In the world broadly, we are in a really weird place around racial equity work. Y'all remember 2020? It was a terrible year. Except the part where we came to squarely face and talk out loud about the extent and impact of multiple intersecting inequities: wealth, policing, education, housing, healthcare. And there was this moment where it seemed that we were collectively on a page that this wasn't the world we wanted to live in. Well, things feel a little different now. And while public discourse about this is waning in the face of lots of very intentional political backlash, the point still stands. Racial inequality is rampant and consequential. We're also in a place, thanks mostly to young people and their activism, where we're more readily acknowledging that climate change is really, like, for real, and we are facing the now inevitable and deeply inequitable impact of severe weather-related events. This is about weather, floods, extreme heat, etc., but it is also about who has the resources to buffer themselves from extreme weather events and who will perhaps not survive. And in education, how will schools help? And what do they need to be prepared to do differently in the face of a future that doesn't look like where we've been? We're also in the midst of alarmingly high levels of political division and uncertainty. Y'all might be here because you didn't want to watch the debate. And this is happening in the context of shifting demographics in the United States, where we are surrounded by new kinds of conversations about immigration, book bans, the exclusionary laws around gender and race that are spreading like wildfire, in addition to the actual wildfires. And in education, we're mirroring some of these things we're seeing in the world more broadly. We've seen new commitments to equity followed by retrenchment, but not in all places equally. School boards are a new political battleground. And in the midst of all this politicization, there are persistent concerns about learning loss, exacerbated inequities, access, under-enrollment, and attrition in key parts of the higher education landscape, such as community colleges. As a nation, we've been pretty consistently slipping in international rankings relative to other industrialized nations. And in schools all over the country, young people are voting with their feet in what is widely acknowledged as an attendance crisis and an expression of alienation and disaffection. And finally, we're in the midst of an alarmingly dire teacher shortage. Major districts are starting school this year hundreds of teachers short. And the problem is worse in areas where children and families already get the least. On the plus side, we know some things about learning that we didn't know 20 years ago that should be helpful. And we also had a moment, again, probably somewhere mid-2020 when we're all home with our kids, where we realized teachers are really important. Was it Shonda Rhimes that said, pay them $1 million? Like, this is a lot. So there's an appreciation and education's in the public eye in a way that it hasn't been in my lifetime. And in philanthropy, despite gobs of money and lots of good intentions, the impact of philanthropy and education hasn't pulled toward a cohesive vision to get us to a better place. There have been visions, to be sure, small schools, Common Core. They have had impact, to be sure, but perhaps not the kind of impact we'd hope for. So I'm going to argue that while this all appears daunting, all of these things together create openings for the future to look different, and indeed constitute a demand and evidence that we will not survive or thrive if the future doesn't look different from the past. It's kind of a change or perish moment. And to get there, we're going to need to unleash the power of education research to imagine, to dream, and to build. But to figure out how we move forward, we first need to understand what keeps us stuck where we are. I'm going to argue that there are at least four ways of thinking about the world that keep us stuck in these reproductive systems that don't serve everyone. The first is zero-sum game thinking. That's the idea that there are only a certain amount of resources, money, time, high-quality educational experiences, and that groups are in competition with one another to get those limited resources. It's the thinking behind all colonial and capitalist systems. Not mad at capitalism, to be clear. But one example of it is the detracking movement in the early 90s when they figured out how to have this intervention that actually really did serve all kids. And who got mad was the middle-class white parents that were like, oh, no, my kid needs to have more. So the idea of there's only a certain amount, and if we're divvying it up, then there's going to be a problem. The second thing that keeps us stuck is transactional views of learning. Most of our education systems are rooted in antiquated views of learning that suggest children are vessels to be filled, that learning is just about cognition, and that learning is a transfer of information, facts, or processes that can happen devoid of connection and relationality. It keeps us stuck in continuing to use models of learning that turns learners off and doesn't respect the range of learners in our classrooms or what they already know. The third is deficit conceptions, defining people by their greatest challenges. Low income, teenage mothers, poor. These deficit conceptions limit our ability to see possibility, and they justify the differentials in access and experience that undermine our democracy. And finally, equity as access to our share of limited resources obviously builds on the first one around zero-sum game thinking. It means viewing equity as getting more of the pie because we have historically gotten less than our share. John Powell calls this proportional equality. It's limited because it similarly keeps us stuck in a fight for the thing as is without rethinking what could be. So I'm going to argue that for each of these four limiting conceptions, what we need to do is reach for a better idea to ground our work. So we need to move from zero-sum game thinking to solidarity dividends. Zero-sum game thinking isn't the only way. Heather McGhee reminds us of this in her 2021 book, The Sum of Us, in which she looks over time at several major public issues: access to good jobs and pensions, purchasing a home, clean air, access to high-quality schools. And for each issue, she notes how racism, at key moments in history, prevented an opening of access right at the point when it would have served Black people or folks from other marginalized groups. And in thus closing down the access for Black people, access was also shut down for poor whites and others who might benefit, thus creating structures that worked against the goal of having a prosperous society. The example she uses in the book is about community swimming pools. And she talks about how, in the 20s, America was really obsessed with this idea of leisure and leisure for everyone and built these big, elaborate pools in cities across the country. And when desegregation happened, white communities were like, whoop, we don't want Black folks in these pools. And in many places, rather than open the pools to public use, they filled them with dirt and covered them over completely. Now nobody swims, right? So that's an example of the way that zero-sum game thinking closes down structures. So her point is that equitable structures serve all of us. And one of the greatest lies is that supporting one group comes at the cost of the well-being of other groups. She writes, "The task ahead then is to unwind this idea of a fixed quantity of prosperity and replace it with what I've come to call solidarity dividends, gains available to everyone when they unite across racial lines in the form of higher wages, cleaner air, and better funded schools." She's arguing that we can all benefit together, and the key is finding policy solutions and approaches where we all stand to gain in the service of strong public services and infrastructure. So if you want to know more about this work, it's really, really amazing. Get the book. She also has a podcast that gives examples of places where people have utilized solidarity dividends. Second, we need to move from a narrow and transactional view of learning to an expanded view of learning. If we're going to build education systems that truly meet the needs of a wide diversity of young people and communities, it must be built on a foundation that views learning in ways that are consonant with multiplicity and the variations and nuances in the way people actually learn. That means recognizing what we know now from the science about relational and contextual, about the relational and contextual nature of learning. I don't think I'm going to go through each of these, but the big idea here is that we know now that learning happens in everyday life with other people and is integrated across domains of development. You cannot learn if you cannot feel connected. That may be an overstatement, but learning is greatly facilitated by the relational, by connection. And it happens naturally in everyday cultural life activities. So often what we do in schools is actually find ways to block this thing that would happen very naturally. So if we take these principles seriously, then we understand that the way we tend to organize teaching and learning and access to curriculum and opportunity in schools is underselling the potential of our young people and is often ill-aligned with how they learn and what they need in order to learn best. Thus, if we want to get unstuck, we have to build new systems that reflect what we actually know about learning. We also need to move from deficit thinking about young people, families, and communities to asset framing. What does this mean? As we noted, deficit thinking defines people and communities by their challenges. Fabian Shorters argues that to define a person by their challenge is the very definition of stigmatizing them. Like, kind of sit with that for a minute. When you think about what it would look like for people to define you by your challenges, I'm directionally challenged. I wouldn't want that to be the defining characteristic. I'm also was a teenage mom. Like, there are many, many ways to think about how that is such a constrained way to view a whole person. Deficit framing primes us then for opposition against equity because we don't believe the unworthy should have what the worthy have. On the other hand, asset framing defines people and communities by their contributions and their aspirations. In doing so, they prime associations of worth and make us less likely to stereotype others and make us more likely not to focus on the individual, but on the systemic obstacles and what facilitates. So he argues that the way that we should think about people in communities is people striving against systemic barriers to accomplish worthy goals. The final pivot in core assumptions that I'm arguing for is to shift from equity as notions of access and new ways of sharing zero-sum game resources to considerations of othering and belonging. This is a hard one because we're deeply invested in zero-sum game thinking. But if we accept, as Heather McGhee encourages us to move to striving for solidarity dividends, then we must give up the idea that our fight is about redistributing finite amounts of resource. But if we're not seeking to redistribute finite amounts of resource, then what are we seeking? John Powell argues that belonging is not only a basic human psychological need, but that it must be at the center of creating systems where everyone thrives. But before we dive into belonging, which we're about to do, let's take a quick look at what belonging is not and the mechanisms that keep inequity in place. That brings us to othering. This is from Powell and Indian, 2024. Othering processes are mechanisms that engender or reinforce social group stigma, dehumanization, inequality, or marginality. In the book, he talks about how othering is really at the heart of all social conflict and issues of inequality across nation states and parts of the world. Current systems of education and philanthropy and research, for that matter, are rooted in processes and practicing of othering. We fund with a savior mentality, and we provide education for other people's children that we know we wouldn't want for our own. Powell and Menindian argue that there are some mechanisms by which societies and nation states keep othering in place. Violence, discrimination and segregation, citizenship and constraining access to citizenship, dehumanization and other narratives, and assimilation and cultural imperialism. What is also fascinating to note is that othering comes out of a need to belong. That is, we other in order to belong. It is an effort toward belonging that comes out of fear. So if othering comes from fear, then belonging is born of love. Belonging is about inclusion, full and unconditional membership. It's an objective feeling, but also about the structures. It has to do with recognition and visibility, places where you are seen and seen as a full, whole human. It provides a sense of connection, which is both an emotional valence, that is, connection is a feeling, and it's also a tether that binds people to one another. And belonging is about empowerment, the power to be self-determining and to create one's reality. So if inclusion is a demand to admit members who have been historically excluded, then belonging is when members of the excluded group are made to feel that they belong, are empowered to have a say in the organizational design or construction or reconstruction of that institution. In belonging, we all get to co-create the thing that we belong to. Belonging is about building a new future together. It invites in a new future that everyone gets to participate in. We can have belonging without othering. Okay, now we have 4 core frames. I'm gonna stop every so often and just do a little recap because I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Solidarity dividends, expanded views of learning, asset framing, and belonging. So let's get clear with those kind of in our back pocket about what we're after creating in education. Then we're going to talk about how current ways of doing research fail to help us get there, and how Spencer's leaning into belonging philanthropy and the funding of transformative research in order to help us move towards education systems that truly serve young people, families, and communities, systems befitting our multicultural democracy. What should education be in a multicultural democracy? I was working on this talk on a plane a couple of weeks ago, and a random guy next to me looked over my shoulder as this slide was up, and he said, "Good. Education should be good." But what do we mean by good? To my mind, we're talking about education systems that foster belonging, and not belonging in a kind of fluffy, common sense parlance way, but belonging in the hardcore John Powell way, right? As about everyone not only mattering fully, but everyone getting what they need so they can contribute what we all need. We have a lot to build on from the research in setting a vision for education systems that support belonging. Here I've represented the frameworks from two collaboratives that have taken this up, the SOLD Alliance and the Bell Framework for Equitable Learning. Both of these frameworks underscore several key features of education and learning systems that support rich, culturally sustaining, and rigorous learning. They call for rigorous and deep learning, attention to development of critical intellectual skills, safety, belonging, cultural affirmation, love, positive developmental relationships and spaces for identity development, new types of relations with families and communities, and critical civic engagement, and transform systems for discipline and restorative justice, ways to share power in new ways. All of this classroom and school level work, and I could write an essay about any one of those, I'm just kind of getting there quickly. All of this classroom and school level work requires a set of enabling conditions. So we can't get to learning that looks like that without systems that attend to each of these things: the teacher pipeline, accreditation requirements, pre- and in-service development, recruitment, retention, wellness. Clearly a major issue we need to be working on. Relations with families and communities, multi-tiered engagement and support, adequate and equitable funding to schools and districts, schools and district practices to support racial integration within and across neighborhoods, diverse curricula, ethnic studies, and learning ecologies that are inclusive of after-school community and summer experiences. And finally, another huge one, assessment. How do we have the kinds of assessment and accountability systems that we need that push us in the direction of the kind of rich goals that we've been talking about? Building these kinds of education systems require us to lean into a solidarity dividend frame. When education systems are designed not to hoard opportunity for an elite subset, but rather to value the ways of being and learning of young people in multiple communities, then we all win, in the form of better and more fully engaged young people prepared to take on the challenging social and scientific challenges of our time. What can we do then as researchers to support these kinds of education systems? And we can think in parallel ways about higher education and early childhood systems that we need, and what prevents us from being useful in this regard. I would argue there's a significant role for research and researchers in this work. In fact, it's critical that research be a part of both crafting a new vision for the future and a part of bringing that vision into fruition, right? So dreaming, but not just dreaming. That will mean that how we do our work as scholars will need to change. And I'm not actually saying that every single one of us needs to do this work, but our field needs a layer where this work is happening. Research should imagine new possibilities for belonging, by which I mean it needs to be a tool to make the world a place where all people, all communities, are fully supported in having lives of joy, safety, and meaning. We have not done this historically in our research. If we're to work towards bringing about the educations we need, then our research needs to evolve as well. We need to evolve our theories and designs to move away from viewing learning as a one-size-fits-all, involving one linear path. We need to move towards viewing learning as involving many pathways, trajectories, and experiences. We need to move away from research designs that stop at just documenting inequalities. We need to move towards research designs that support the imagining and building of new systems. We need to move away from research that frames families, communities, and young people as being in deficit and works to fix them. We need to move towards building the existing strengths and building on existing strengths and legacies of families, communities, and young people. We also need to evolve our process of research, and some of this pulls from the 2022 IES, the Future of IES report that Adam Gamron led, beautifully done. We need to move away from doing our work alone, in silos, in divergence, and in disconnection. We need to move towards doing our work in collaboration, interdisciplinarily, in an integrated way that holds deeper respect for families, communities, teachers, and other stakeholders. We need to learn with them and from them. We need to move away from an overemphasis on intervention models and scaling, and towards a focus on possibility, ecological context, and heterogeneity. And we need to move away from short-term and small-scale studies only towards more ambitious programs of research with longer terms and wider scope. And finally, we need to evolve research to center impact. We need to move from a focus on findings from individual studies to focus on field-level findings. What do we know from the body of research, not just what do I know from the study that I did? And finally, we have to move away from impact as an afterthought. Impact needs to be built in from the beginning of the research process, from the scope and topic to the communications plan to the relationship building and consultation. And we've been talking about this at Spencer as transformative research. We argue that transformative research centers belonging in problem framing, in process, in outcomes, in goals. It takes up large-scale challenges, issues, or opportunities to transform systems, is rigorously designed, gathers usable evidence, and it actively moves towards policy practice and our pedagogical change. Linda Darling-Hammond says sometimes that what scholars have done historically is have a set of findings and throw them over the wall, hoping someone over there is going to catch them on the other side and make them useful. So we're arguing the opposite, that actually the intentionality about where your research is headed and the impact that it will have is really, really critically important. And we think there's some critical ingredients to doing this work, focusing on the concerns and priorities of children and youth and their families and communities, starting with the people closest to the experience, right? Taking a systems view on the persistence of inequality and what's involved in transforming systems towards justice, using collaborative inquiry to engage in the search for solutions to persistent problems and co-design strategies to realize the visions of communities for more equitable systems, and building from the histories, cultures, and strengths of local community and school partners in this research. And finally, we need to hold ourselves answerable to meaningful change. And that kind of notion of accountability and what we hold ourselves accountable for is critical both in this part about what we're up to as a field, but it's also critical in the part about what philanthropy is up to as it does its work. What are we accountable for and what are we accountable to do? So transformative research then is one way that research can be a part of the solution. And I'm going to say more about our funding of this kind of work, but for now I want you to hold that this way of conducting research is possible and can lead us towards new and better ways of developing education systems that center the needs of learners. Belonging Philanthropy. It's about fostering new ways of engaging and of funding. I want to acknowledge that this term came about as I was sitting with John Powell over lunch, telling him about the Spencer work. John is an old friend and colleague of mine. And so I was bubbling about the new work and the transformative research and the funding and how we're doing it. And some of you that know him know he's like Zen in how he shows up. So we're like opposite energies. I'm like this and he's like this. So he looked at me and he said, sounds like you're doing Belonging Philanthropy. I was like, oh, that's good. I'm taking that. So here we are. Philanthropy is an odd kind of thing. It's a field where your whole job is to spend money, tax-sheltered money, in order to make something better in the world. Some foundations have a broad mission, like Ford or MacArthur, where they seek to work on the most pressing and global problems of our time: climate change, preserving democracy, and opportunity and outcomes across many sectors and globally. Other foundations have missions that are scoped more narrowly. The Mellon Foundation focuses on supporting the humanities and higher education. W.T. Grant and Russell Sage focus on social science research. At Spencer, as I've noted, our focus is to fund education research in order to improve lives. At their essence, foundations hold big pots of money that are sitting in investments, which causes the pot hopefully to grow every year, and they spend the dividends. And because it has to some degree involved wealthy people, even if it's just the dead wealthy person that left the money, deciding what to fix, solve, or put money into, philanthropy itself has historically, and in many places still, been an act of both privilege and paternalism. It has taken people who have most benefited from the structures of society and asked them to figure out how to support those who have not benefited. along with the big tax breaks. So we're paying for this money, by the way. Y'all know that, right? And people know this is problematic. This is not news, right? People in philanthropy know this is problematic, and they talk about it. And they talk about ways to remedy it. And they talk about things like spending down endowments, right? Because the idea is if you have an endowment that's in perpetuity and some person that died 100 years ago set an agenda for this money and you're continuing to live out that agenda, that's like an undue influence, right? So spending down is a way to say, we're going to spend the money on the thing, and then other people get to say new things that we're going to spend money on. People have also talked about trust-based philanthropy or respect-based philanthropy that's about new kinds of relationships between funders and grantees. People have also begun to consider what they call the other 95%, right? If the spend is the 5% that we're making in dividends, the other 95% is sitting somewhere in investments. Could it be doing more good in the world? Should we be thinking differently about that 95%? So and sometimes we don't think about the harm that money sitting in endowments could be doing. For example, you might be a foundation that focuses on child welfare, but you have investments in gun manufacturing and the distributions of tobacco and alcohol, right? So there's some tensions there. We've been digging into that a bit. These are all important moves, and I applaud them. And I also think that if our goals are to change the world, to make it more just, and to support more love, more belonging, and more thriving, then we need to do even more to do our work differently as a sector. So this is where Belonging Philanthropy comes in. And I'm going to describe Belonging Philanthropy by setting it in opposition to Othering Philanthropy, which I view mostly as current state. So Othering philanthropy defines people by their challenges and essentializes social groups. Those other, the poor, are those out there, right? And it's interesting as you see diversification in leadership in philanthropy, when the other becomes us, like when the impacted by carceral systems is like my uncle that just got out of jail for being in prison for 30 years. Like it's much harder to distinguish the us from the them in those situations. Anyway, Othering Philanthropy defines people by their challenges, essentializes social groups. It centers in its practices, processes, and frames competition, comparison, and status. Right? If you're in Othering Philanthropy, your job is to pick the best things, put them in competition with each other, and divvy up the money. It deepens dehumanization by requiring assimilative frames and solutions that bend people to systems. So in opposition to that, Belonging Philanthropy defines people by their strengths and dreams and recognizes complexity and multiplicity. And I think you could think about this in terms of nonprofit organizations that are doing various kinds of work in the world, but also researchers and how we evaluate research. So defining people, scholars, by their strengths and dreams and recognizing complexity and multiplicity. It centers collaboration and collective growth, and it makes space for humanization by demanding new frames and solutions which bend systems to people. What do we need? What are the systems we need to be whole, functioning people? So what does it look like to enact Belonging Philanthropy? It looks like funding work that dreams a new future, that moves past the status quo. It looks like attending to who makes decisions and who sees themselves as reflected in your work. It looks like considering the unintended consequences of your practices. It looks like being transparent. There's a lot of black boxness in philanthropy. You don't know how the decisions are made. You don't know what the criteria were. You don't know what the whole pot of money is. All of the things. When I first started at Spencer, and this gets into the next part, but I'll tell the story anyway. We were preparing to go to AERA. My AERA colleagues are here in the front. And I said to one of the staff members, well, does everybody have their hotel? Are we all situated? And they said, oh, yeah, we don't stay at the conference hotel. I was like, oh, why don't we stay at the conference hotel? Well, because then people will ask us questions. So we changed that year. And it speaks to the lack of transparency. People should ask you questions. You work here, and you're here on a work trip. So we're not avoiding interacting with the folks who could be grantees or who are grantees. It also looks like living your values internally, in grant-making processes, in funding programs, that every aspect of your work should reflect your values, not just the grant-making. I mean, including the grant-making, but not just the grant-making. I get there. Okay, now that I have outlined Belonging Philanthropy, I want to reiterate where we've gotten so far this afternoon. We've established it's a challenging moment in education in the world, and there are some new frames that we need to invite in order to be a part of creating a new kind of education system that serves all children, as researchers and as funders of research. We've established that one way research can be a part of the solution is to embrace new models of research in the direction of transformative research. We've also established that that how we have to show up as funders also needs to shift if we're going to fund new kinds of work, new kinds of research. And one of the ways we can show up differently is by embracing belonging philanthropy. And all of that has been somewhat abstract so far. So let's dig into some details about what the journey towards belonging philanthropy has looked like at Spencer and how we're leaning in on transformative research as a key strategy. And I'm going to tell the story of Spencer's journey by focusing on these 4 aspects of the work. 1, our redefining of who we are. 2, our shifting of how we fund. 3, the impacts to who we fund, and the evolution of what we fund. And I kept changing the order of those, so clearly they're like all interrelated. I'm gonna share them in a certain order, but I'm not quite sure the order works, or maybe it doesn't matter, but they all move together. Who we are. So the first step in our journey was to better understand where the field was and what it needed. We engaged, this is in 2018 when I first started, we had a long, very laborious field engagement where we asked people to tell us what research they were doing, what research they wanted to be doing, what got in the way of them doing that kind of work. And because we knew that we had to start with what folks needed from us. The danger in philanthropy is that you're starting with yourself. You're starting with what you care about, what you think is important, what you think the world should be. And then you end up imposing that on the world in a way that is actually a real abuse of what it means to be a funder. It's easy to fall into that space. So we learned some things about what the field wanted. One of the main things the field wanted was for their work to be more useful. They wanted their work to matter to the world. They felt like they're doing this great work and no one is listening. That's largely true in education research. We also realized that for us to be a better service, we needed to be clear about who we were as a foundation, what our goals were, and to make shifts where our practice and our values didn't align. For us, that involved several key elements. 1, it involved us clarifying our mission, our values, our goals. It's like the thing they all, it's like business 101, but it actually also really matters to give you a North Star that you can kind of continue to come back to. We also realized that you can't ask for work in the world that you can't do inside of your own organization. So we also needed to expand our internal tent, our board, our staff, our reviewers, and we needed to address the other 95% and aligning our investment values with our philanthropic values. And importantly for Spencer at the time, as I kind of indicated by the story about not staying in the non-conference hotel, we needed a broader we. We needed to message a broader tent because most people in our field felt like they were not a part of the Spencer family, that was for those elite people over there. So we needed to build a broader sense of who belongs, whose work belongs under the tent. So I'm going to say a little bit, a couple of these, clarifying our values, mission, and goals. Here's where we got to around our mission. We believe that education research is integral to improving education, making education systems more equitable, and increasing opportunities to learn across the lifespan. So that's kind of our North Star, is being in that place. Our tool, we're super clear, is education research, but we want that to be useful in the world. We also had some conversations about how we were intending to live that mission out in our work and came up with several core commitments that we were committed to across our research programs, funding work that's rigorous, relevant, equitable, transformative, and collaborative. And we made some changes over time about who was in the room. This shows the demographic shifts from 2017 to 2022, which is the first 5 years of my presidency. And you'll see there we did some work that increased the diversity of the board and the staff. Still lots more work to do always. And we did that because we knew that it mattered who was in our decision-making spaces. The makeup of our staff and board are consequential for our work and our funding decisions. And this matters not just symbolically, but it matters for who makes the decision and the range of perspective folks bring to the work. And so we invited in perspectives that had not previously been well represented. And as we did so, we attended to the culture of the organization and the board to make them places where we invited in disagreement, debate, and multiple perspectives. Along with these changes in who was in our decision-making rooms, we also made changes to how we did our work. I could talk for 10 years about this slide. I will not, because I got my timer on. 6 minutes left in case you're getting a little sleepy. 6 minutes, 5 minutes, Seggy Fresh. Okay. So I don't know which ones of these I want to talk about. Okay. We did a set of things that we feel were really consequential to both what we ended up funding and how we ended up as a staff thinking about our work. The first was diversifying the reviewers. We had historically used very high-profile scholars who were previous grantees, who were relatively late career stage to review proposals. And what we came to realize is a few things. One, if we wanted to diversify who was having access to our funding, we needed to diversify who was making the decisions and how those proposals were being reviewed. So we recruited earlier a broader racial and ethnic diversity, earlier career stage scholars and scholars from various institutions. We also came to learn in doing that provided a really important professional development opportunity for those folks. So once you see 20 proposals and you rate them, you now have a really great sense of what a high quality proposal looks like. So people have found that to be valuable, if a little labor intensive. We also did some things to make our processes more equitable. One of the things we did that was really consequential and really hard was this first bullet, developmental feedback. So when I started, we were giving feedback to the top 30% of proposals. So if you sent in a research proposal and it made it to the finalist round, you got feedback because those were the ones that went out for external review. We flipped it so that actually every single proposal goes out for external review because the people furthest from knowing how to get this right actually need the feedback the most. And that came out of a conversation with a group of faculty where somebody asked, hey, this is a group of faculty in the disability studies SIG. Y'all may know they're hardcore. So somebody was like, hey, I sent in a proposal and I got it back. It was a decline, no feedback. So I have no idea why this didn't get funded. And I did my usual spiel. You have a spiel. People ask that question a lot. I was like, I know it's really tough. We just don't have the bandwidth to give feedback on every proposal. There's only 6 staff members and we really can't do it, but we really wish we could. And I said that 100 times. This person said to me, that's not good enough. She said, I would never forget the moment. She said, do you mean to tell me, as the president of the Spencer Foundation, you can't figure out how to provide feedback to all the proposals? You just don't want to. And I was like, it was like in a public forum. But she was right. She was absolutely right because we did. We decided that we would figure it out and we figured it out. And it means a lot of sending things out to a lot of ad hoc reviewers, but it has mattered. We send out declinations now where people say, thank you. Thank you for this feedback. And then they revise. I didn't bring the numbers, but we have numbers of how often people now get funded on the second try or the third try or the fourth try. I was telling the group of faculty earlier, we had a person who got a large grant on the 5th try. We were cheering in the room. She was excited on the phone. So it allows for the possibility of the work getting better and changes our function. So our function becomes not just evaluating work. Our function becomes supporting the development of better work, right? There's a few other things. I'll say a little bit about transparency. It's really important when you're in a field that doesn't require much of you, that you require a lot of yourself. And so university contexts provide very different resources for folks to learn how to write successful grants on every dimension imaginable. So we did a bunch of things to try to make explicit what we were looking for in public grant writing resources, guides, more on the website. We now do office hours with program staff, so you can go on the website, anybody, and sign up for office hours and have a one-on-one conversation with a program officer. We also got transparent with ourselves and with the field about our goals and how we were and were not accomplishing them. We have an annual report now that talks about who we fund, who we bring in as reviewers, and we're measuring for ourselves how well we're doing on the metrics that we think are important. And we're using data in new ways to inform our decision-making. Okay, keep it going, Na'ilah. Who we fund. These processes has changed who we fund in some pretty fundamental ways. You'll see here, this chart shows people that send proposals into us, so applicants, you'll see between 2019 and 2023, modest increases in the diversity of who applies for funding, not a tremendous amount of change. But when you look at who we funded, who got the grant money, you see some, I say significant, relatively significant changes in who we have funded. The percentage of scholars of color went from 27% in 2019 to 47% in 2023. So attending to range and diversity and multiplicity really matters in who has access to resources to do and grow their work. We've also made some changes in the types of institutions that we fund. I'm not going to stop there. We did some things. We did some more things. Say a little bit about this. In 2021, my staff got super fascinated with the idea of deficit-based research and how to recognize it and what it was. It was right at the time when we had done, we did these post-COVID grants, and they were supposed to be focused on racial equity. We got 700 proposals in the door in that first cycle. And I read them all myself, as did Megan Bang, who was the senior vice president. I read fast. And the staff we were all together really wrestling with, we said these were supposed to be about racial equity. Why do they feel so icky? Why do they not feel like they're fundamentally about? Why do they not feel loving? Why do they feel like that? And so we did this analysis where we coded 1,500 proposals to think about what it meant for research to be deficit-based or strength-based, and then we came up with this new category of equity-based. And so this is just our own kind of internal thinking about what it looks like when research shows up with strength-based frames. And I wanted to say a little bit about our transformative research program. We had recently announced 2 new programs with the goal of supporting transformative research. We talked a bit about that research that's designed to reimagine education systems for equity. And in some ways, this body of work, to me, brings together like the how we fund, the what we fund, and the who we fund, because we are seeking to expand who is qualified, who knows how to help education systems do things differently. That tent should include scholars of many different disciplines and methodological approaches. It should include folks with many different types of expertise, and it should include scholars in deep collaboration with families, with communities, with educators, with systems leaders, with higher education systems leaders, with community-based organizations, with policymakers, so on and so forth. And so we came up with this new program. It's about fostering collaboration, centering equity, foregrounding impact, and it has basically 3 components. 2 of which are funding opportunities. The first is convenings, and we have this science now of how to bring people together across lines of many kinds of difference, disciplinary difference, methodological difference, deep epistemological difference, deep theoretical difference, into a productive space to identify together the cutting edge of research and what are the problems in the world we need to solve and how could we solve them. So convenings. And the other 2 are funding opportunities. The first is vision grants, which are planning grants. We invite people to come together in teams across stakeholder groups, method, and discipline to identify a problem and a solution that comes out of research. And so it's a grant that says, here's a big issue we're going to work on. At the end of this planning grant, we're going to have a proposal about the evidence we're going to collect and then what we're going to do with that evidence to create systems change. And then out of those vision grants, we fund 1 to 2 transformative research grants a year, which are the like, okay, now do the thing you planned and said you were going to do, let's do it. And so that's that. And let me just wrap. I began by noting that we are in consequential times. As we speak, a presidential debate is happening for an election that is perhaps one of the most consequential elections of our time in terms of which direction our country will head. Our education system and indeed our world needs a new model, a new paradigm, a way of reimagining who we serve, in what ways, and for what purpose. So in some ways in this talk, I feel like I'm making grand claims, right? I'm arguing that we can use the power of belonging philanthropy to fund research on education that opens up possibility for systems transformation to support education systems where children and communities thrive. And I think our claims and work have to be bold. I was listening to a talk last week by Tanya Allen at the McKnight Foundation. She's doing this amazing work around Black wealth. And she said when she first started describing this super ambitious work, people told her it was impossible. And she said that what she learned to say when they said that was, well, have you ever seen the impossible happen? And she said most people, just about every person, in fact, she asked that question to, said yes. They had seen the impossible happen. So I'm comfortable with the grand claims. Like, I'm comfortable with reaching for something that really, really matters in the world. And for me, a vision of education research that is deeply useful to practitioners and policymakers and which is profoundly respectful of communities, young people, and educators is possible. And scholars need to be much more engaged in the dreaming of a new future, and funders need to be much better prepared to fund those dreams and to work with you all to bring them to fruition. And I will end there.